Victoria Lane stood on the bridge of the starship horizon, her eyes scanning the endless stretch of dark space ahead. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the crew prepared for another routine patrol near the outer colonies. Captain Eric Mason walked beside her, his expression calm but alert. He knew that even the quietest parts of space could hide danger. Lieutenant Danielle King adjusted the controls, checking the sensors for any unusual activity. She had learned not to ignore a single blip, no matter how small it seemed. The humans had grown confident in their technology, and that confidence often gave them an advantage. Energy shields glimmered across their ships, and drones hovered in silent formation, ready to respond to any threat. Victoria trusted her team, but she knew the galaxy held surprises that could strike without warning. Suddenly, a signal appeared on the monitor. It was faint and strange, something the humans had never seen before. Jonah Miller, the chief engineer, leaned over to study it. He shook his head. This signal was not from any known human colony or trade station. Victoria's brow tightened. She gave the order to track it and move closer. Downed, as they approached the source, the strange signal grew stronger. Victoria ordered shields up and weapons ready. Captain Eric Mason gave the crew precise instructions. Everyone worked in perfect coordination. Humans were trained for danger, and this crew was among the best. The first encounter came suddenly. A small fleet emerged from the shadows. They were unlike anything the humans had faced. Their ships were fast, sleek, and heavily armed. Lieutenant Danielle King fired the warning shots, but the fleet ignored them and moved aggressively. Victoria took a deep breath. This was the moment humans had been preparing for. She gave the command to attack. Energy pulses lit up space as human ships fired. The drones deployed, moving like swarms around the enemy. Humans had learned to fight as one, and their inventions made them deadly. The battle was chaotic. Human ships dodged and weaved using speed and clever maneuvers. Jonah Miller's inventions worked perfectly, giving humans an edge. Captain Eric Mason led a daring move, cutting through the enemy line to protect a vulnerable cargo ship. Lieutenant Danielle King followed his lead, taking out an enemy vessel that had been targeting civilians. Despite the human skill, the enemy was strong. Their weapons struck hard, and some human ships were damaged. Victoria felt the weight of command pressing on her shoulders. She knew the crew trusted her, and she could not fail. She ordered a retreat to regroup and plan a counterattack. As the horizon moved away from the battlefield, Victoria looked at her crew. They were tired, but their eyes burned with determination. Humans had faced impossible odds before, and survived. This encounter would not be their last, but it showed that they were ready. In her quarters, Victoria reviewed the data from the battle. Jonah Miller suggested improvements to their weapons and shields. Victoria listened, taking notes. Every invention, every strategy, and every brave action would prepare them for the challenges ahead. Humans had a way of turning small advantages into victories, and she was determined to make sure they did it again. The night in space was quiet now, but Victoria knew it was only the calm before the storm. She felt a spark of excitement. Humans were not just survivors, they were inventors, fighters, and leaders. The galaxy might think they were just another species, but Victoria Lane and her crew would prove that humans were something far more powerful. Space stretched before them, full of unknown dangers, and Victoria knew that humans were ready to face them. The war was coming, and when it did, humans would not just fight. They would win. The human fleet regrouped at the edge of the outer colonies. Victoria Lane stood on the bridge of the flagship, her eyes fixed on the screens showing damaged ships and enemy positions. Captain Eric Mason walked beside her, his jaw tight with determination. The first battle had been rough, but it had also shown them weaknesses they could exploit. Lieutenant Danielle King was already planning the next move, coordinating with Jonah Miller to upgrade the weapons and shields. Victoria gave the order to prepare for a counterattack. Humans could not afford to wait. The enemy was strong, but they underestimated human skill and invention. Jonah worked quickly, fitting the ships with new plasma coil launchers and adaptive shields. Drones were reprogrammed to move faster and strike more precisely. Humans had a way of turning every setback into an advantage, and Victoria intended to show that now. The enemy fleet returned, larger and more aggressive. Human scouts reported multiple ships advancing from unexpected directions. Victoria did not panic. She gave clear commands. Human crews were trained for chaos, and their training showed in every move. Captain Eric Mason led a strike team to intercept one of the enemy flanks. Lieutenant Danielle King commanded the defense, positioning ships to protect weaker vessels. The battle began with blinding energy bursts. Human ships weaved through the enemy fire, using speed and shields to avoid destruction. Plasma coil launchers fired with precise timing, striking enemy ships before they could react. Drones swooped in, disabling weapons and engines. Humans moved as one, their teamwork giving them an edge against the overwhelming force. Jonah Miller monitored the enemy ships and noticed a pattern. They moved in predictable sequences, leaving gaps in their formation. Victoria acted immediately. She ordered a coordinated strike, splitting the fleet into small groups to attack the weak points. Captain Eric Mason led one of the groups, diving through enemy lines and destroying 2 ships in quick succession. Lieutenant Danielle King followed with her squadron, taking out another cluster with rapid-fire plasma bursts. The enemy faltered. Their formations broke, and confusion spread among their crews. Humans pressed the advantage. Victoria watched as her strategy unfolded perfectly. She gave the order to capture a damaged enemy ship. The boarding team moved in with speed and precision, securing the vessel and recovering valuable technology. Every invention and tactic they used made the humans stronger and the enemy weaker. Despite the success, the battle was not easy. Human ships took damage, and some crews were injured. Victoria made quick decisions, sending reinforcements where needed and repairing shields in real time. The determination of humans to survive and fight back was clear in every action. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King inspired their crews with bravery, showing that humans would never surrender. As the enemy retreated, Victoria surveyed the battlefield. Humans had won this encounter, but the war was far from over. The captured technology would give them an advantage in the next fight, and every victory strengthened their confidence. Victoria knew that human inventions, skill, and courage were the keys to survival and dominance. That night, Victoria and her crew worked tirelessly. Jonah Miller tested new weapons, and Lieutenant Danielle King trained pilots for the next battle. Captain Eric Mason shared tactics with other commanders. Humans learned quickly and adapted faster than anyone expected. Victoria felt a surge of pride. Humans had faced overwhelming odds and had not only survived but struck back with power and intelligence. The stars stretched endlessly ahead, full of dangers. Victoria smiled slightly. Humans were ready. When the enemy returned, they would meet not just fighters but inventors and leaders. Humans had begun to turn the tide, and Victoria knew the war was about to change forever. Victoria Lane stood in the command room, watching Jonah Miller test the new human inventions. Energy shields shimmered across the fleet, adaptive drones hovered in formation, and the plasma coil launchers glowed with power. Victoria smiled. Humans had the tools to turn the tide of the war. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King joined her, ready to plan the next strike. The enemy had regrouped after their last defeat. They were stronger and more aggressive, but humans had learned from the first battles. Victoria reviewed the data carefully. She knew the key was to use inventions to hit the enemy where they were weakest. Jonah explained the new modifications. The energy shields could absorb heavy fire. Drones could attack automatically with precision, and the plasma coil launchers could destroy multiple enemy ships at once. Humans were ready for a decisive move. Victoria gave the order to move toward the enemy supply route. If humans could disrupt it, the enemy fleet would lose coordination. Captain Eric Mason led the attack squad, flying with skill and courage. Lieutenant Danielle King commanded the defense, making sure every human ship stayed protected while maintaining a strong offensive. The human crews felt confident, knowing their inventions gave them an advantage they had never had before. The first clash was intense. The enemy fired with heavy energy beams, but the adaptive shields absorbed most of the impact. Drones moved in automatically, disabling weapons and engines on the enemy ships. Human pilots performed daring maneuvers, striking from angles the enemy did not expect. Plasma coil launchers erupted with energy, breaking enemy lines and causing confusion among their crews. Captain Eric Mason led a direct assault on a key enemy command ship. He dodged heavy fire, weaving through attacks while his squad struck precisely. Lieutenant Danielle King's squadron hit enemy supply ships, preventing reinforcements from arriving. Every move was calculated, and every invention worked perfectly. Humans used strategy and skill to make up for any difference in numbers. Jonah Miller directed new drones to capture enemy ships instead of destroying them. Humans boarded them, recovering advanced technology and gaining valuable intelligence. Victoria watched the operation closely, giving commands that turned the battlefield into a human-controlled zone. The enemy began to panic. They had expected humans to fight, but not with this level of innovation and coordination. The battle continued for hours. Humans were relentless, striking at weak points while defending their own ships. Captain Eric Mason led boarding teams, taking over ships from the inside. Lieutenant Danielle King organized counterattacks whenever the enemy tried to regroup. Victoria coordinated the entire fleet, her orders precise and fearless. Humans were not just fighting, they were dominating. By the end of the battle, the enemy was in full retreat. Their formations were shattered, and human inventions had made them vulnerable in ways they could not anticipate. Victoria allowed a moment to assess the victory. Humans had proven that skill, strategy, and innovation were stronger than raw strength. The captured technology would allow them to improve even further. As the fleet returned to the outer colonies, Victoria addressed her crew. Humans had begun to turn the war in their favor. Inventions were more than tools. They were weapons of survival and dominance. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King shared their experiences, teaching other crews the tactics that had worked. Jonah Miller began designing even more advanced weapons. Inspired by the captured enemy technology, Victoria knew this was only the beginning. Humans had shown their power, but the war would continue. With inventions, courage, and strategy, they could face any threat. The stars stretched endlessly before them, but Victoria was certain that humans would meet every challenge. Humans were not just fighters, they were leaders of their destiny, ready to change the balance of power in the galaxy forever. The human fleet moved quickly across the outer colonies. Victoria Lane stood on the bridge of the flagship, watching screens showing enemy movements. Intelligence reports warned of multiple enemy fleets preparing to attack at once. Humans could not wait. They had to act before the enemy struck with full force. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King prepared their crews for the largest battle they had faced yet. Jonah Miller activated the new drones and weapon systems. Energy shields flared across the ships, and plasma coil launchers glowed ready to fire. Humans had learned from every previous battle. They knew the enemy's tactics and weaknesses. Victoria made sure every ship was in position, ready to respond to any attack. She gave clear orders, and the crew followed without hesitation. Humans were trained to fight as one, and their unity made them stronger than the enemy expected. The first wave of the enemy arrived faster than expected. Human scouts reported dozens of ships moving in formation. Victoria gave the command to engage. Plasma coils fired, hitting multiple enemy ships at once. Drones swooped down to disable weapons and engines. Humans dodged attacks with skill, weaving through enemy fire while striking back precisely. Captain Eric Mason led a squadron through the enemy lines, destroying 2 ships and capturing another. Lieutenant Danielle King coordinated defense, keeping human losses to a minimum. The battle grew more intense. Enemy ships attacked from all directions, but humans used clever strategies to gain the advantage. Victoria ordered small groups to strike weak points, while main fleets held the line. Jonah Miller directed drones to block enemy reinforcements. Humans were not just defending, they were controlling the flow of battle. Every invention, every tactic, every brave action turned the tide. Human boarding teams moved quickly. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King led squads into enemy ships, disabling weapons and taking control from the inside. Humans moved faster and thought smarter than the enemy. Victoria watched as her strategy worked perfectly. Enemy crews panicked as humans exploited gaps in their defenses. One by one, enemy ships fell under human control, or were destroyed. As the battle raged, Victoria ordered surprise attacks on enemy supply lines. Humans destroyed fuel reserves and communications stations, cutting off reinforcements. The enemy could not regroup. Humans pressed forward, their energy shields holding against heavy fire. Drones attacked relentlessly, striking fear into enemy crews. Humans were not just fighting, they were winning decisively. Hours passed, but humans did not slow down. Captain Eric Mason led daring raids, taking out key ships, while Lieutenant Danielle King organized counterattacks whenever the enemy tried to regroup. Jonah Miller repaired shields and weapons on the move, keeping humans fighting at full strength. Victoria directed every action, her leadership inspiring courage and determination across the fleet. By the end of the day, the enemy fleet was in full retreat. Human inventions, strategy, and bravery had turned a dangerous situation into a victory. Victoria allowed a moment to review the battle. Humans had proven they could face overwhelming odds and win. Every crew member had shown skill and courage. The captured technology and battlefield experience would make humans even stronger in the next encounter. Victoria addressed the fleet. Humans had shown they could fight as one, using brains and courage as weapons. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King shared their tactics with other crews. Jonah Miller prepared new inventions for the battles ahead. Humans had not just survived, they had dominated. Victoria knew that the war would continue, but humans were ready. The galaxy was learning that humans were not ordinary. They were powerful, inventive, and unstoppable. Victoria Lane studied the map of the enemy fleet. Their command center was heavily guarded, but she knew humans could reach it with careful planning. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King gathered their squads. Jonah Miller prepared the newest inventions, including shockwave grenades, gravity disruptors, and automated turrets. Humans had learned from every battle, and now they would strike at the heart of the enemy. The human fleet moved silently through the dark reaches of space. Victoria coordinated every action, watching for enemy patrols. Captain Eric Mason led the first squad, weaving through enemy fire with precision. Lieutenant Danielle King followed, protecting the flanks and keeping weaker ships safe. Drones moved ahead, scouting for traps and alerting humans to any danger. The first enemy defenses were strong. Energy barriers blocked direct fire, and automated weapons fired relentlessly. Victoria gave the order to deploy gravity disruptors. The barriers collapsed under the sudden force, and human ships surged forward. Plasma coil launchers struck enemy ships before they could react. Drones disabled weapons and engines, leaving enemy crews confused and vulnerable. Human boarding teams moved quickly. Captain Eric Mason led the first group onto an enemy vessel. They disabled weapons and took control, gaining intelligence about the command center. Lieutenant Danielle King's squad captured a supply ship, cutting off reinforcements. Humans moved with speed and coordination, striking from angles the enemy did not expect. Jonah Miller monitored the battlefield, adjusting weapons and shields in real time. Automated turrets fired at precise targets, while shockwave grenades disabled enemy crews. Humans combined invention with strategy, making each move count. Victoria watched carefully, giving orders that turned chaos into advantage. Humans were not just fighting, they were dominating the battlefield. The command center came into view. It was heavily armed, surrounded by dozens of enemy ships. Victoria gave the order to attack. Captain Eric Mason led a daring strike. Weaving through heavy fire while Lieutenant Danielle King's squad attacked from another angle, drones moved ahead, disabling defenses and opening a path for boarding teams. Humans reached the command center and began the assault. Boarding squads moved with speed, taking out key enemy positions and capturing critical systems. Jonah Miller used newly captured technology to hack enemy controls, turning weapons against their own fleet. The enemy panicked as humans gained control of the center. Victoria coordinated every strike. Humans captured communication arrays and weapon systems, preventing the enemy from calling reinforcements. Captain Eric Mason led the final push inside the command center, neutralizing remaining resistance. Lieutenant Danielle King secured escape routes and ensured all crews were safe. Humans had turned the tide, and the enemy had no choice but to retreat. As the human fleet regrouped, Victoria reviewed the victory. Humans had struck at the enemy heart, using inventions, strategy, and courage. The captured command center provided intelligence and technology that would make future battles easier. Humans had proven they were more than fighters, they were leaders and innovators. Victoria addressed the crew. Humans had shown that skill, teamwork, and invention could overcome any force. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King shared lessons from the mission, and Jonah Miller prepared upgrades for the fleet. The galaxy would remember this battle. Humans had not just survived, they had conquered. Victoria looked at the stars, The war was not over, but humans had the power and the brains to win. They would continue to fight, using every invention and every strategy to dominate. Humans were unstoppable, and the next battles would prove it even more. The human fleet advanced toward the enemy stronghold. Victoria Lane stood on the bridge of the flagship, her eyes fixed on the largest enemy ship. This was the center of command, and taking it would decide the war. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King readied their crews. Jonah Miller prepared the latest inventions, including gravity disruptors and plasma coil launchers upgraded with captured technology. Humans were ready for the final assault. The enemy noticed the human fleet approaching. Alarms blared across their ships. Victoria gave orders calmly, positioning human ships to block escape routes. Captain Eric Mason led a strike team to breach the outer defenses. Lieutenant Danielle King coordinated flanking squads to strike weak points. Drones moved ahead, scanning for traps and disabling defensive weapons. Humans moved with precision, striking faster than the enemy could react. The first wave of fire hit human ships, but adaptive shields held strong. Energy pulses from plasma coil launchers destroyed enemy vessels before they could recover. Jonah Miller directed drones to board damaged ships, capturing key technology. Humans moved methodically, weakening the enemy one step at a time. Captain Eric Mason led daring attacks, disabling turrets and creating openings for boarding teams. Finally, the human boarding teams reached the enemy command ship. The battle inside was intense. Humans moved quickly, using shockwave grenades to neutralize enemy crews and gravity disruptors to control movement. Lieutenant Danielle King led squads through corridors, taking control of critical systems. The enemy commander, a strong and skilled leader, tried to resist, but humans were faster and smarter. Victoria gave the order to capture the enemy leader alive. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King cornered him in the central chamber. Jonah Miller used a device to disable his weapons. The commander struggled, but could not escape. Humans finally took him into custody. Victoria watched as the captured leader was secured. This victory was more than physical, it was psychological. Humans had shown their intelligence and power. With the commander captured, human forces gained full control of the enemy fleet. Victoria directed crews to secure ships, disable remaining defenses, and recover technology. Drones patrolled every corridor, ensuring no resistance remained. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King oversaw the operation, making sure every human acted efficiently. Humans had turned chaos into total order. As the battle ended, Victoria reviewed the results. Humans had proven that strategy, invention, and courage could defeat even the strongest enemy. The captured technology would allow improvements in weapons, shields, and drones. When humans were no longer just surviving, they were leading. The enemy had underestimated them completely, and now humans had total control. Victoria addressed her crews. Humans had shown that bravery, intelligence, and teamwork could win the impossible. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King shared tactics that could be used in future battles. Jonah Miller began designing new inventions based on captured technology. Humans had achieved a turning point, and the war had shifted in their favor permanently. As the stars stretched across space, Victoria smiled. Humans were no longer the hunted. They were masters of the battlefield. The captured enemy commander was proof that humans were clever, inventive, and unstoppable. The final victory was near. Victoria knew that humans would not just survive, they would dominate every challenge the galaxy could send their way. Victoria Lane stood on the bridge of the flagship, her eyes scanning the last enemy fleet. It was smaller than before, but still dangerous. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King readied their squads. Jonah Miller checked the upgraded weapons and drones one last time. Humans had learned from every battle, and this final fight would prove their dominance. The enemy fleet attacked without warning. Energy blasts lit the darkness of space. Human shields absorbed the impact, and plasma coil launchers fired with deadly precision. Drones moved in swarms, disabling enemy weapons and engines. Humans weaved through fire, striking from angles the enemy did not expect. Every move was calculated, every action designed to win. Captain Eric Mason led a strike team directly at the heart of the enemy formation. Lieutenant Danielle King took command of the flanks, preventing reinforcements from reaching the front. Jonah Miller monitored the battle, adjusting weapons and shields in real time. Human inventions and strategy worked together perfectly. Humans were faster, smarter, and braver than the enemy could imagine. The enemy tried to regroup, but humans anticipated every move. Gravity disruptors pulled enemy ships off course, while shockwave grenades disabled key weapons. Automated turrets fired with deadly accuracy. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King led boarding teams, taking over ships from the inside. The enemy commander tried to rally his forces, but humans had already captured the communication arrays. Chaos spread through the enemy ranks. Victoria gave the final orders. Every human ship focused on the remaining enemy vessels. Plasma coil launchers struck simultaneously. Energy shields blocked all retaliation, and drones disabled engines and weapons. Human boarding teams moved in to secure every ship. The enemy had no chance to recover. Humans were not just winning, they were conquering completely. Hours passed, but humans did not falter. Captain Eric Mason led daring raids, taking out the strongest enemy ships. Lieutenant Danielle King coordinated counterattacks, striking anyone who tried to escape. Jonah Miller repaired shields and weapons on the move, keeping humans at full strength. Victoria directed every action, her calm leadership turning the battle into a human victory. At last, the enemy fleet was defeated. The surviving ships surrendered, and humans took control of every vessel. Victoria allowed a moment to absorb the victory. Humans had fought with courage, skill, and intelligence. Every invention, every strategy, every brave action had led to this final triumph. The galaxy would remember that humans were unstoppable. Victoria addressed the crews across the fleet. Humans had proven that skill, courage, and invention could overcome any enemy. Captain Eric Mason and Lieutenant Danielle King shared their experiences, teaching lessons for the battles that might come. Jonah Miller prepared further upgrades, making sure humans would remain strong. Humans had achieved ultimate victory, not through luck or numbers, but through brains and bravery. As the stars stretched across space, Victoria looked at her fleet. Humans had claimed dominance over the enemy and secured the outer colonies. The war had ended, and humans were victorious. They had shown that they were not ordinary fighters, they were innovators, leaders, and masters of their destiny. Humans would continue to protect their territory, invent new weapons, and prepare for any challenge. The galaxy had learned a lesson. Humans were not to be underestimated. They were the future, and nothing could stop them. The stars shone brightly over the victorious human fleet. Victoria smiled with pride. Humans had fought, invented, and conquered. The war was over, but the legacy of their courage and skill would last forever. Humans were ready for anything, and the galaxy would never forget the name Victoria Lane or the strength of her people.